There is a city in Russia that you cannot simply decide to visit. You can buy the plane ticket. You can pack your bags. You can show up at the airport with every intention of landing there by sunset. And you can still be turned away because this city does not let people in just because they want to come. And once you're inside, leaving isn't always simple either. That's the first thing that should sound strange. In a world where you can fly to almost anywhere on Earth with enough money and a working passport, there's a town buried in the Siberian Arctic that operates by a different set of rules entirely. A town where roughly 200 foreign visitors are allowed in during an entire year. A town with no roads connecting it to the rest of the country. A town built, quite literally, by people who had no choice but to be there. Picture landing there for the first time. The plane drops through a thick gray ceiling of cloud, and for a moment there's nothing below you but white. No rivers, no forests, no other lights on the horizon. Then the runway appears out of nowhere, a single dark scar cut into the snow, and the moment the cabin door opens, the cold doesn't ease its way in. It arrives all at once, like stepping into water instead of air. Somewhere past the terminal, beyond a checkpoint most travelers never even see, a guard is holding a list, and your name is either on it or you're getting back on that same plane. So the real question isn't just, what is this place? It's, why does a city need to control who comes and who goes in the first place? And the answer to that question is so strange, so layered, that by the time you understand it, you'll understand why this might be one of the most extreme places human beings have ever decided to call home. This is Norilsk. And before we get to the cold, before we get to the darkness, before we get to any of it, you need to understand one thing. Norilsk is rich. Genuinely, statistically rich. The ground beneath this city holds some of the largest nickel and palladium deposits on the planet, and the company that mines it produces something close to a fifth of the entire world's nickel supply. That's the And. A city sitting on a fortune, in a region most of the world has never heard of. But the same isolation that protects that fortune is what makes living here one of the harshest bargains a person can make with their own body. Therefore, what you're about to see isn't a postcard. It's a survival story that happens to have apartment buildings in it. Let's start with the part most people get wrong before they even arrive. The idea that Norilsk is simply far away, the way Antarctica is far away, or the way a remote island is far away. It isn't. Norilsk sits inland, in the middle of a continent, surrounded by Russian soil in every direction. And yet it might as well be an island. There is no highway that connects it to Moscow, to Krasnoyarsk, to any other city in the country. None. If you want to drive there from anywhere else in Russia, you can't. The roads simply stop existing long before they reach you. For most of the year, the only way in is by air. For a few short weeks in the summer, when the Yenisei River isn't locked under ice, cargo ships and the occasional passenger ferry can reach the port town nearby and unload everything the city needs to survive the next 10 months. Food, fuel, equipment, parts for machines that can't be repaired with anything found locally. Imagine planning your entire year around a river's mood, knowing that if you miss the shipping window, you wait until the ice breaks again. And then there's the permit. Since the early 2010s, Norilsk has carried an official status as a closed city, which means foreign citizens cannot simply land and walk out of the airport. You need permission, filed in advance, and even then, approval is not guaranteed. Journalists get rejected. Researchers get rejected. People with what seem like perfectly reasonable purposes get rejected, and Russian authorities aren't required to explain why. The official reasoning involves the city's strategic industrial importance, the kind of mineral wealth governments don't like outsiders wandering around unsupervised. But ask anyone who has actually been here, and they'll tell you there's a second, unofficial reason hiding underneath the first one. They don't necessarily want the rest of the world to see what living here actually looks like. We'll get back to that. But first, you need to understand how this city came to exist at all, because the history here isn't just background information. It's the reason everything about Norilsk feels the way it does today. In the 1920s, Soviet geologists confirmed what local hunters and indigenous communities had quietly known for generations. The ground beneath this stretch of Arctic tundra was extraordinarily rich in metal ore. Nickel, copper, cobalt, platinum, an entire periodic table of value, sitting almost 1,000 kilometers north of anywhere reasonable to build a city. Under normal circumstances, no government would attempt construction there. The permafrost alone makes it nearly impossible. Soil that never fully thaws, so unstable that buildings need to be raised on stilts driven dozens of meters down, just so the heat from a single apartment doesn't melt the ground beneath it and swallow the whole structure. Walk through the older parts of the city today, and you can still see the proof of that fight against the ground itself. Entire apartment blocks rest on concrete piles driven 30, sometimes 40 meters down into frozen earth, engineered so that the warmth leaking out of someone's kitchen never reaches the permafrost below and turns solid ground into mud. Get it wrong. And over the decades, more than a few buildings did get it wrong, and a structure can tilt, crack, or sink as the earth beneath it quietly shifts. It's one thing to build a city in a harsh climate. It's another thing entirely to build it on ground that can change its mind. But this wasn't normal circumstances. This was Stalin's Soviet Union, and there was a tool available that no modern construction company would ever have: forced labor. Starting in 1935, prisoners from the Gulag system were sent north in mass numbers to build Norilsk from nothing. Not volunteers, not contracted workers paid a wage. People convicted, often on fabricated or political charges, were marched into one of the most lethal climates on the planet and ordered to build mining infrastructure with little more than basic tools in their own hands. Historical estimates put the death toll during those camp years somewhere in the tens of thousands. People who froze, starved, or simply collapsed from exhaustion building roads, railways, and smelters in temperatures that regularly dropped past minus 50 degrees Celsius. The city didn't officially exist yet. It was still a prison camp wearing the early shape of an industrial town. It wouldn't receive formal city status until 1953, the same year Stalin died, and the same year that, slowly, the system that built this place began its long collapse. Here's the detail that should stop you for a second. Many of the descendants of those original prisoners never left. Some couldn't afford to. Some had nowhere else that felt like home anymore. Some simply grew up here, married here, and had children here, until being from Norilsk became its own kind of identity, inherited not through choice, but through circumstance, generation after generation. So when people ask why anyone would still live somewhere this extreme, part of the honest answer is their grandparents didn't get to decide either. And somewhere along the way, this frozen, isolated, mineral-rich pocket of the Arctic simply became theirs. Today, more than 170,000 people call Norilsk home. That number alone should surprise you. This isn't a research outpost with a skeleton crew rotating in and out every few months. This is a full-functioning city. Apartment blocks, schools, hospitals, a university, restaurants, a public transportation system, built into a landscape that, for roughly half the year, actively tries to kill anyone who isn't prepared for it. And the city isn't only made up of the descendants of those original prisoners. Long before any of this existed, the Dolgan and Nenets people were already living across this stretch of tundra, following reindeer herds through a landscape they understood on its own terms, without concrete or steel involved at all. Some of that world still brushes up against the modern one. It isn't unusual. Even now, for reindeer to be brought in from outlying camps, so indigenous families can do something as ordinary as grocery shopping in the city center. A herder's sled parked outside a Soviet-era apartment block. Two completely different ways of surviving the same Arctic, existing one street apart from each other. Let's talk about that landscape, because this is where most documentaries about cold places get lazy. They show you snow, they tell you the temperature, and they move on. That's not what we're doing here. Imagine stepping outside in late January. The air doesn't feel like cold the way you understand cold. It feels physically solid, almost something you have to push through rather than walk into. Exposed skin can develop frostbite in minutes, not hours. The metal handle of a car door will take a layer of your glove with it if you grip it without thinking. Locals don't warn newcomers about the temperature number. They warn them about the wind, because a still -30 is survivable in the right clothing. But add wind chill on top of it, and the same air becomes something closer to a weapon. Winter here doesn't last a season. It lasts most of the year. Snow covers the ground for somewhere around 250 to 270 days, meaning the brief, almost shy appearance of green grass in July feels less like summer and more like a rumor the city tells itself to stay sane. And then there's the darkness. From roughly the end of November into the middle of January, the sun simply does not rise. Not rises late, does not rise. For around 6 weeks, Norilsk exists in a permanent dusk to black cycle, where even at what should be the brightest point of the afternoon, the sky offers nothing more than a dim gray smear near the horizon before sinking back into night. Most people who have never experienced a true polar night assume the hardest part would be the cold. It isn't. Locals will tell you, almost without exception, that the absence of light does something to the mind that the temperature never could. Sleep schedules collapse. The body, deprived of the light cues it depends on to regulate itself, stops producing the signals that tell it when to rest and when to wake. People describe weeks of insomnia followed by weeks of exhaustion. A heaviness that settles into the chest and doesn't leave until the first sliver of real daylight returns in late January, an event some residents genuinely treat like a holiday. The city has adapted in ways that sound almost like science fiction until you remember they're not fiction at all. Apartments are fitted with UV lamps to simulate sunlight. Schools used to march children outside specifically to sit in front of artificial light for a few minutes a day. Solariums, small tanning bed-style rooms, are common, affordable, and treated less like a luxury and more like medicine. Vitamin D supplements aren't a wellness trend here. They're closer to a public health requirement. There's a tradition among longtime residents. They call surviving your first full polar night a kind of unofficial test. If you make it through without breaking, without leaving, without needing to escape south the moment the planes start flying again, you've proven something to yourself and to the city. If you don't make it through cleanly, you usually don't come back for a second one. Ask someone who's lived through a dozen of these winters, and they'll tell you it never fully stops being strange. One longtime resident, describing her first polar night to a visiting journalist, put it almost like a fairy tale gone sideways. Weeks that felt like one long, unbroken evening, where the only thing marking the passage of time was the clock on the wall, because the sky certainly wasn't going to do it for her. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's simply what 6 weeks without a sunrise does to a person's sense of time. Locals have a name for the worst version of a Norilsk storm, the black blizzard. Not because the snow turns black, because the wind and snow together swallow so much light that visibility collapses to almost nothing, even in the middle of the day. The most infamous one on record tore through the city in 1957, lasting for days, ripping roofs off buildings and knocking out power to entire mining districts. People couldn't see their own outstretched hand. To get from one building to another without losing your way and freezing in the open, residents strung ropes between apartment blocks, hand over hand, the way a climber moves along a fixed line on a mountain. That practice never fully disappeared. Even today, building numbers in Norilsk are painted unusually large, sometimes meters tall, lit and color-coded, specifically so a person caught outside in a whiteout can still find their way home by feel and outline alone. But here's the loophole nobody tells you about beforehand. 6 months later, the exact opposite happens. During the height of summer, the sun barely sets at all, hanging low near the horizon through what should be the middle of the night, painting the sky in this strange, washed-out gold that never fully commits to either day or night. Locals call it the white nights, and after months of total darkness, that constant light is its own kind of disorienting. Children playing outside at midnight, blackout curtains becoming standard equipment in every bedroom, the entire city quietly negotiating with a sun that refuses to follow normal rules in either direction. So picture the full cycle now. A town that vanishes into near total darkness for 6 weeks, and months later drowns in light it never asked for. A town that can only be resupplied by sea for a few short weeks a year, and otherwise depends entirely on planes landing through blizzards that ground flights without warning. A town where 200 foreigners, give or take, are permitted entry annually. Fewer people than fit inside a single mid-sized movie theater. You'd think that combination alone, the dark, the cold, the isolation, the paperwork, it would be enough to define a place like this. And for most documentaries, it would be. They'd show you the snow, mention the temperature, and call it a wrap. But none of what we've covered so far is actually the reason locals describe Norilsk the way they do when the cameras stop rolling. It's not the reason doctors track certain health statistics here more closely than almost anywhere else in Russia. And it's not the reason that, on certain days, the snow itself doesn't fall white. Because the cold, brutal as it is, isn't actually the thing that makes Norilsk dangerous to live in long term. The real threat doesn't come from the sky. It rises out of the smokestacks, and it's been settling into the ground here for almost a century. That's where we're going next. Picture catching snow on your sleeve here and noticing, before it even melts, that it isn't white. It's gray, sometimes faintly metallic at the edges, like ash falling instead of frost. That's not a trick of the camera. That's just what winter looks like, downwind of the largest heavy metal smelting operation on Earth. Now picture breathing it in. Locals describe a particular taste that settles at the back of the throat on the worst days. Faintly sulfuric, almost like the air itself has gone slightly sour. Long-term residents say you stop noticing it after a while, the way someone living next to train tracks stops hearing the trains. Visitors notice it immediately, and most of them never quite stop noticing it for the rest of their stay. Norilsk Nickel, the company this entire city exists to serve, releases somewhere around 2 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the air every single year. To put that number somewhere, your brain can actually hold it. That's more sulfur pollution than the entire country of France produces annually, all concentrated into roughly the footprint of a mid-sized American city. Satellite researchers tracking industrial emissions worldwide have found exactly 2 kinds of sources that release sulfur dioxide at this scale: smelting complexes like this one and erupting volcanoes. There is functionally nothing else on the planet that competes, and the ground remembers it. Drive out from the city center and the boreal forest that should surround a place like this simply isn't there anymore. Not stunted, not thinning, just gone. Scientists studying tree rings in the region traced the damage back decades, watching the annual death rate of surrounding larch forest climb from a steady few percent a year to nearly a third of all trees dying annually once emissions accelerated in the mid-20th century. By some estimates, the dead and dying forest stretching out from Norilsk smelters now covers an area larger than the entire state of New Jersey. Stand at the edge of it in summer and you're looking at bare gray trunks for as far as the horizon allows, a forest someone could have walked through as recently as their grandparents' lifetime. In 2016, a river running through the city turned the color of rust almost overnight, locals waking up to water the shade of diluted blood flowing past their apartment windows. The company blamed abnormal rainfall and pipeline maintenance. Residents had their own theories. 4 years later, a fuel tank near the city collapsed and released close to 20,000 metric tons of diesel into the surrounding waterways. One of the largest land-based fuel spills ever recorded in the Arctic, staining rivers for kilometers as it spread toward a nearby lake that indigenous communities downstream had fished and depended on for generations. Cleanup crews worked for months. Some of that contamination, scientists say, will outlast everyone watching this video. One leader from the Nganasan people, one of the indigenous groups whose traditional territory surrounds the city, summed up what decades of this had done to the air in a single, blunt sentence to a journalist. That there are days here when you simply cannot breathe comfortably outdoors, full stop, regardless of the temperature on the thermometer. For a culture that lived alongside this land for thousands of years before anyone discovered nickel underneath it, that's not a complaint about inconvenience. That's a description of a homeland that no longer behaves the way it used to. So here's the part of the story most people never connect to: the postcards of glowing apartment towers and northern lights. Studies looking at workers in the city's heaviest industrial roles have found life expectancies running roughly a decade below the Russian national average. Children growing up nearest the smelting plants show measurably higher rates of certain respiratory conditions than children living just a few districts further away. None of this is hidden information. It's published, studied, occasionally even acknowledged by the company itself. It's just not the version of Norilsk that makes it onto a glossy travel brochure, assuming Norilsk ever bothered making one. Now you understand the second reason this city doesn't let just anyone wander in with a camera. It isn't only about protecting mineral secrets. It's about controlling exactly how much of this story the rest of the world gets to see. Here's the strange part, though. When Norilsk's closed status was officially confirmed back in 2011, the government's stated justification wasn't secrecy at all. It was care. Officials framed the decision as a way to unlock extra social benefits reserved specifically for residents of closed cities: subsidized housing, additional pension contributions, priority placement in regional programs. On paper, sealing the gates was a gift to the people already living behind them. Whether you read that as genuine policy or convenient cover for limiting outside scrutiny probably depends on how much you trust the people writing the policy. Either way, the practical result is the same one we opened this video with. A city that decides almost entirely on its own terms, who gets to see what's actually happening inside it. To be fair, this isn't a story the city is ignoring. In recent years, local authorities have opened an entire municipal department focused purely on environmental management, and the company itself has begun investing hundreds of billions of rubles into closing its oldest, dirtiest production line and building sulfur capture systems designed to claw a meaningful share of those emissions back out of the air before they ever reach the sky. Independent monitoring groups remain cautious about how much of that promised reduction has actually materialized so far, and it's the kind of project measured in decades rather than headlines. Whether that effort fully repairs decades of damage is a separate question. But the fact that it's happening at all tells you something. Even the people running this place know exactly what the cost of all that wealth underground has been. And that's the trade nobody mentions when they talk about Norilsk's fortune. Wages here genuinely do run well above what the same job would pay almost anywhere else in Russia. A holdover from a Soviet-era policy that still applies across the country's far north, stacking extra percentage points onto a paycheck simply for choosing to live and work above a certain latitude. Engineers, machinists, miners, teachers, doctors. Nearly every profession in Norilsk earns some version of that northern premium, which is exactly why so many people who could leave choose not to. The arithmetic is brutally simple. A decade here can fund a life almost anywhere else in the country, assuming your lungs hold up long enough to collect it. Talk to workers who've spent their careers at the smelters, and a pattern tends to repeat itself. Most of them arrive with an exit plan. 5 years, save aggressively, buy an apartment somewhere south where the sun actually rises every day, and leave. Some genuinely follow through on exactly that plan, suitcase packed the same week their contract ends. Many more find themselves still here a decade later. The 5-year plan quietly extended every winter, the city's strange gravity proving harder to escape than the math on paper ever suggested it would be. Ask them why, and the honest ones will usually admit they're not entirely sure themselves. Only that somewhere between year 3 and year 8, leaving stopped feeling like the obvious choice it once was. Which brings us to the question this whole video has been circling since the opening shot. With the cold, the closed checkpoints, the months of darkness, the gray snow, and the air itself working against you, why does anyone actually stay? Talk to someone who has lived here for 20, 30 years, and the answer rarely starts with money. It starts with something closer to loyalty, to a place, to a community, sometimes to people who are no longer alive to explain why they stayed in the first place. One Norilsk resident, reflecting on what keeps a person rooted somewhere this unforgiving, put it almost like a survival pact. When a blizzard is strong enough to knock you off your feet and burn exposed skin in under a minute, you don't get through it alone. You hold on to whoever's shoulder is closest and you walk together, because the alternative isn't really an alternative at all. That isn't a slogan painted on a wall here. It's closer to a fact of daily life, repeated so often it stopped sounding like wisdom and just became normal. That dependency reshapes a community in ways comfort never does. Kitchens here still function the way they did generations ago. Not a culture of restaurants and reservations, but of someone knocking, someone putting the kettle on, someone making space at a small table without needing much of a reason. Neighbors check on each other after storms almost automatically, not because anyone organized it, but because everyone understands that next time they might be the one who needs checking on. People raised in Norilsk often describe leaving for university in the south and feeling oddly lonelier in cities with millions more people in them, because somewhere along the way, this town quietly taught them that survival and connection were the same skill. Remember those descendants of the original Gulag prisoners we mentioned earlier, the ones who never left, generation after generation. Talk to enough of them and you start to notice they rarely describe their connection to the city in terms of forgiveness for what happened here, or even resentment toward it. It's simpler and stranger than either of those. This is just where their family is from now. The same way someone elsewhere might trace their roots to a coastal fishing village or a farming town, here the roots trace back to a camp built by force in temperatures that would kill an unprepared person within hours. History didn't choose to make this place anyone's home. People did, afterward, one generation at a time, almost as an act of quiet defiance against the very system that put them here in the first place. There's also something else holding people here, something less emotional and more architectural. By the time most residents are adults, this is simply what normal looks like to them. Giant glowing house numbers cutting through a whiteout. Reindeer parked outside a grocery store. A solarium visit fit in between errands the same way someone elsewhere might grab a coffee. The world's most extreme weather events have, for them, become Tuesday. Visitors arrive expecting trauma and instead find routine, which might be the single strangest thing about this entire city. The unbearable, given enough time, becomes ordinary. People don't survive Norilsk so much as they absorb it until the line between the two stops mattering. So let's go back to where we started, that 2-second flash before this video even introduced itself. The glowing tower against a sky that never turns blue. The smoke bending sideways off a smelting stack. The checkpoint, the gloved hand checking a passport. By now, you understand every piece of that image in a way you couldn't have 30 minutes ago. You understand why that sky looks the way it does, what's actually inside that smoke, why that checkpoint exists, and why, despite every reason to leave, more than 170,000 people still call the other side of that gate home. Imagine standing at that same checkpoint yourself right now, breath fogging in front of you, watching the guard scan a list for a name that isn't yours. On one side of that barrier, everything familiar, everything easy, everything you could walk away from without a second thought. On the other side, gray snow, a sky that disappears for 6 weeks at a time, air that occasionally tastes faintly of sulfur, and somehow, against every instinct telling you it shouldn't be possible, a community that holds itself together tighter than almost anywhere softer ever could. Which side of that gate would actually change you more, do you think? It's worth sitting with that question for a second longer than feels comfortable. Most of us will never need to answer it for real. We'll watch this video, maybe shiver a little at the thought of -50, and go back to a version of life with grocery stores open past midnight and a sun that rises on schedule every single morning without fail. But it's worth asking, just for a moment, what exactly we're trading for that ease, and whether the people behind that checkpoint, gray, snow, and all, might understand something about belonging that the rest of us quietly lost somewhere along the way. Maybe that's the real story underneath all of it. Not a frozen town nobody is allowed to leave, but a frozen town almost nobody chooses to leave, even when they finally have the means to. Norilsk isn't a prison built from fences and guards. Not anymore. It's something closer to gravity, a place harsh enough to break most people, generous enough to reward the ones who stay, and tightly knit enough that walking away starts to feel like the harder option, not the easier one. The checkpoint at the edge of the city was never really the barrier. The barrier is everything this place quietly becomes to the people who survive their first winter in it. There are still questions this video hasn't answered, and honestly, some of them might not have clean answers at all. What happens to a city like this when the ore beneath it eventually runs out, the way it has in mining towns everywhere else in the world? The Russian Arctic isn't short on cautionary examples. Scattered across this same region are settlements that once looked exactly like Norilsk does today. Full apartment blocks, working schools, a population that assumed permanence, until the resource underneath them ran dry and the company pulled out. What's left now are genuine ghost towns. Stairwells full of snow instead of people. Classrooms with chalkboards still half-written. Entire neighborhoods abandoned within a handful of years once the paychecks stopped. Norilsk has watched those towns die from a comfortable distance, and everyone here knows exactly what that distance is built on. Does the gravity holding people here survive without the wealth underneath it? Nobody in Norilsk seems eager to find out, and for now, the deposits beneath this city are large enough, decades worth by most estimates, that the question stays comfortably theoretical rather than urgent. But theoretical questions have a way of becoming real ones eventually, usually right around the moment nobody's prepared for them anymore. If this kind of place pulled you in the way it pulled in everyone who's ever actually lived here, you already know what to do. Hit subscribe so the next deep dive into the world's most extreme towns lands in your feed the moment it's out. Drop a comment and tell us which closed city, which forbidden island, which impossible corner of the map you want us to dig into next. We read every single one, and more than a few of our recent videos started exactly that way. And if you made it this far into a 30-degree below story without looking away once, do us a favor and hit like before you go. It's the easiest way to tell the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to reach more people who'd never have heard of this place otherwise. Because somewhere out there, past another stretch of frozen tundra most maps barely bother labeling, there's another town keeping its own secret from the rest of the world, and we're already packing for it.